what happens when a music genre gets so grand, so intricate, so utterly full of itself that it just implodes. Well, think about it. By 1979, the music world was buzzing with a different tune. Critics were savaging prog rock, calling it bloated. Fans once devoted were starting to ditch it. And the mainstream, they completely tuned out. But here's the million-dollar question, folks. Was prog's towering ambition its ultimate undoing? Or was that very ambition actually its greatest strength? Let's dive in and see what the hell really went down. Now, it's easy looking back now from the comfort of our armchairs to dismiss the perceived demise of prog rock in the late 1970s as just another casualty of changing fashion. I mean, come on. You had punk screaming onto the scene, fast, raw, angry and undeniably rebellious. Then there was disco, all clean lines, infectious beats and pure, unadulterated fun, made for getting down on the dance floor. Compared to these new kids on the block, prog, with its elaborate arrangements and sprawling compositions, looked like an over-engineered relic, a dinosaur lumbering towards extinction. But the real picture, believe me, is far more nuanced, far more complex than a simple case of a genre falling out of favour. What truly happened to progressive rock wasn't a single decisive death blow. No, this was a slow, agonising process, a death by accumulation. The very genre that set out to push boundaries, to boldly go where no band had gone before, eventually pushed too far, too often, and frankly, too earnestly. And in doing so, it inadvertently alienated and ultimately lost the very people who had once championed its grand vision. By 1979, the writing wasn't just on the wall, it was practically spray-painted there in neon letters. The bands that had utterly dominated the first half of the decade were either taking extended sabbaticals, drastically downsizing their sound, or in some cases, disbanding altogether. Take Yes, for example. They released Tomato and all, an album that, even in their most fervent, dyed-in-the-wool fans, found almost impossible to defend. It felt off. Then there was Emerson, Lake and Palmer, remember those guys? They delivered Love Beach, an album with a cover that looked like a prog rock behemoth, once lauded for ambition orchestral suites, and more like a cheesy Bee Gees promo shot from a holiday brochure. It was an aesthetic disaster, a visual metaphor for a band seemingly lost at sea. And then there was Genesis. They were smart, or perhaps just pragmatic. They'd already begun to shift gears, steadily injecting more accessible pop elements into each successive release, with Phil Collins gradually, almost imperceptibly, taking on the more central role both as vocalist and crucially as songwriter, with a keen ear for a hook. Now, the late great critic Robert Christgau pictured the prevailing sentiment perfectly in 1977 when he quipped, "Progressive rock is what your older brother listened to when he got tired of Led Zeppelin, but didn't want to admit that he really liked Elton John." That sting wasn't just sarcasm, fellas. It was a brutally honest observation that perfectly encapsulated how alien and esoteric prog had become to the average rock listener. It was no longer the sound of youthful rebellion pushing musical boundaries. It had, to many, become the sounds of highly skilled musicians, impressing, well, mostly each other. Let's be absolutely clear about one thing. Those early years of prog rock were nothing short of a remarkable, even revolutionary period in music history. Think about the albums like Yes's Close to the Edge, Genesis's Selling England by the Pound, or King Crimson's Red. These weren't just complex records, they were breathtakingly adventurous. They effortlessly wove together the intricate ambitions of jazz, the structural grandeur of classical music, and the raw energy of rock, all bundled into one seamless, exhilarating package. They were held together by jaw-dropping musicianship, a relentless pursuit of innovation, and a fundamental belief that music could and should be far more than just a 3-minute single designated for radio consumption. These were the days when musicians dared to dream big. They were the trailblazers, the explorers of uncharted sonic territory. They proved that rock could be intellectual, it could be challenging and deeply profound without sacrificing its power. But here's the nub, and it's a crucial one. Ambition, when left unchecked, when allowed to run wild without any sense of constraint, can very quickly begin to feel less like artistic purity and more like sheer indulgence. And by the mid-1970s, this creeping sense of indulgence was becoming a very real, very palpable issue. Songs which once boasted impressive but contained lengths now routinely exceeded 10 minutes, sometimes stretching past 20. Listen to Jethro Tull's A Passion Play or parts of Yes's Tale from Topographic Oceans, and you'll get the idea. The lyrics, meanwhile, had taken a deep dive into realms of impenetrable mysticism, esoteric science fiction, or vague, often self-important poetry. Album covers, once artistic and evocative, became intricate, almost academic puzzles designed to be pored over for hours. Fans who had initially admired the sheer craftsmanship and daring scope now started to feel, well, frankly, excluded. It wasn't just the complexity that was the problem, though. It was the growing sense that prog had stopped speaking to real life, to human condition, and instead had retreated into a self-contained intellectual echo chamber. It felt less like a conversation and more like a lecture. Meanwhile, the wider music industry was undergoing seismic shifts. The economic slump hitting the UK particularly hard at the time meant that record labels, never really known for their boundless altruism, became far more risk-averse. They were looking for quick returns, not long-term and artistic investments. Then punk exploded onto the scene, not just a musical counter-movement, but as a profoundly financial one. It was cheap to produce, quick to record, and generated headlines, really almost effortlessly. Suddenly a band could grab a few chords, a cheap guitar, and a raw attitude, and be in the public eye. Prog, by stark contrast, with its lavish week-long studio sessions, its custom-built instruments, its colossal stage sets, and its army of roadies, became an incredibly difficult proposition to justify financially. One producer at Atlantic Records famously grumbled around 1978, "I can cut a punk album for $15,000. Now a Yes album was 5 times that, if you're lucky. And frankly, I'm not feeling lucky these days." The numbers simply didn't add up for the bean counters. Radio, the lifeblood of popular music, didn't help either. Stations, especially in the US, began to prioritise shorter, punchy, more instantly gratifying songs. FM radio, which had once been a haven for long-form tracks, for album cuts that defied traditional single formats, now faced immense pressure to deliver clearer, more commercially viable programming. Songs like Genesis' Supper Ready or Emerson, Lake and Palmer's Tarkus, magnificent as they were, had virtually no hope of getting airtime. This drastic shift in exposure hurt progressive bands more than most, as they rarely released conventional singles to begin with. Their art was in the album, the complete work. But beyond the external pressures, there was also the pervasive sense of internal fatigue within the bands themselves. Imagine spending months, sometimes years, perfecting complex arrangements, touring grueling schedules of the massive stage productions. It takes its toll. Rick Wakeman, the legendary keyboard wizard, formerly of Yes, later candidly admitted, "After a while we were trying to out-clever each other. It stopped being fun." Now the joy, the spontaneity, the collaborative spirit that had fueled the early breakthroughs seemed to have been replaced by a competitive desire for ever greater complexity. Jethro Tull's Ian Anderson, reflecting on sprawling, often impenetrable tracks like A Passion Play, conceded, "We were trying to say too much too quickly, and not everyone had the patience to keep up." It wasn't just the audience getting lost. Sometimes the artists themselves were drowning in their own creations. The creative well for some had simply run dry, or at least become muddied by overthinking. And yet, it's crucial to remember that prog rock simply didn't collapse overnight in a heap of Moog synthesizers and 20-minute drum solos. It was a gradual decline, and some bands, credit where it's due, evolved. Genesis, as we've mentioned, arguably survived the era best by astutely shifting towards more accessible, song-orientated songwriting. By the time Duke arrived in 1980, the band had embraced a decidedly new sound, leaner, punchier, more focused, and their fans, remarkably, largely followed them. They didn't abandon their progressive roots entirely. but they certainly trimmed down the fat. Others faded or fractured. King Crimson, ever the innovators, disbanded in 1974, only to re-emerge in the early 1980s with a surprisingly stripped-back, funk-inflected, guitar-driven approach that sounded fresh and utterly contemporary. Yes, the ELP sputtered through multiple lineup changes, releasing albums to increasingly mixed reviews, never quite recapturing their mid-70s magic. There's also a deeper, more philosophical question here. Did prog rock truly fail because it became too clever for its own good, or did it lose its way because it simply lost touch with the raw primal emotions that drive people to music in the first place? Think about those early records. Despite their often daunting length and intricate structures, they still possessed a profound emotional core. Tracks like Further Fifth by Genesis or Starless by King Crimson, these just weren't technical showcases. They were emotionally rich, deeply moving pieces of art. They had soul. But as albums became increasingly rigid in their structure, more overtly conceptual in their themes, and more preoccupied with intellectual prowess, that fundamental human connection, that visceral impact, seemed to weaken. When bands start writing music primarily to impress other musicians or to satisfy their own intellectual curiosity, rather than to genuinely move or connect with an audience, the effect can be profoundly alienating. The listener feels like a spectator at a highly technical exhibition, rather than a participant in a shared emotional experience. Still, to reduce this entire complex narrative to a simplistic prog got too clever, this would be a disservice and frankly inaccurate. The end of the 1970s was a period of monumental cultural realignment, a true sea change. Punk didn't kill prog, it simply rushed in to fill the very real, very vibrant space that prog had, perhaps unwittingly left behind. Disco didn't murder it, it gave people a reason to dance again, to embrace joy and simplicity after years of cerebral musical journeys. Prog wasn't definitively defeated by harsh critics. It was, more accurately, weakened by its own inability to adapt quickly enough to faster, leaner and more economically driven music market. Yet the influence of prog rock never truly vanished. Far from it. It simply went underground, or rather, it permeated the musical landscape in more subtle, less ostentatious ways. Bands like Marillion, IQ and Pendragon admirably carried the torch into the 1980s, keeping that flame alive for a dedicated, if smaller, audience. And if you listen closely, you can hear echoes of progressive music in later wildly successful bands. Think about the structural adventurousness of Radiohead, the intricate rhythmic complexity of Tool, or even the epic scope and technicality of modern metal bands like Mastodon. All of them, in their own ways, picked up elements of the progressive tradition and wove them into new tapestries in the decades that followed. Now, what had fundamentally changed was the attitude. The overt seriousness, the sheer spectacle, the unbridled ambition of classic prog were no longer worn so proudly on the sleeve. Instead, they were embedded, often quietly influencing songwriting structure, instrumental tone, and overall musicality without necessarily needing a 20-minute track or a concept album about mythical creatures. So, back to our original question. Was prog rock's ambition its ultimate downfall? Well, in a way, yes, it certainly contributed. The very elements that made it feel bloated, self-indulgent and impenetrable to some were also the same elements that inspired its most loyal, passionate and intellectually engaged fans. Prog rock had the sheer audacity to think bigger, to be deliberately awkward, to demand more from its audience than passive consumption. Now, it didn't always succeed. Sometimes it crashed and burned, spectacularly on occasions. But when it did succeed, it created records that still held immense weight, still inspired awe, and still resonated deeply decades later. There are monuments to a time when musicians truly believed that there was no limit to artistic expression within the rock idiom. The real takeaway here isn't that progressive rock died a definite death in the late 1970s. It didn't. It simply stopped being fashionable, front and centre, face of popular music. The vast majority of the crowd moved on, lured by simpler rhythms and more immediately gratification. But those seminal records, they're still played, they're still studied, they're still dissected, and most importantly, they still matter. Because when a music genre aims for the stars, it might sometimes miss the mark spectacularly. But sometimes, just sometimes, it reaches places that no one else even dared to dream of going. And that, my friends, is a legacy worth celebrating. So what are your thoughts on this? Did prog truly get too big for its boots, or was it a refusal to compromise its ultimate triumph? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, whilst this video discusses how prog ended, the video I shot here looks at how these 6 bands formed the basis of how prog rock gained traction to begin with. Now that's the video I want you to watch next, and I'll see you over there.